Hi. Thanks for being with us. I'm Robert Bryce. This is the Power Hungry Podcast, where we talk about energy, innovation, politics, and of course, power, and power in the broad meaning of power, electric power, energy, and also political power. So I'm very pleased to have as my guest today, Matt Ridley. We've been acquainted for some time. Matt has written many books. I think, is this number 9, Matt?
It's number 9 if you count proper books, but there's the odd sort of compendium of articles along the way as well.
Sure, of course. So I could introduce you and bring you, talk about a lot of things that you've done. I could call you Viscount. I could call you a lot. Why don't you introduce yourself as to someone who you've not met and say, I'm Matt Ridley. I'm something. Go ahead. Introduce yourself if you don't mind.
Good challenge. I'm Matt Ridley. I write books. They're nonfiction books. They usually have a science content, but increasingly I also write about economics. And in particular, the last 3 books have been about innovation in one form or another. And I have a science background. I also have a career in journalism. I've done other things as well. And I currently sit in the House of Lords in the UK Parliament, where I sit on the Science and Technology Select Committee.
And today we're here to talk about your 9th book, which is How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. So you mentioned science. If you don't mind, I'll just follow up on that. So you've written a lot about science, and I do a little bit as well. I write a little bit about the energy business myself. One of the things that I've noticed, and you must have as well, is the level of scientific illiteracy among the general public and numeracy. And it's made a career for you, of course, being able to discuss these things. But is that your perception as well, that the public is generally speaking, scientifically illiterate and want to learn it? Or tell me how you see that.
Yeah, well, on one level, I think people are very reasonable, very keen to understand what they don't understand. And it's not reasonable to expect them to understand advanced molecular biology and genomics, because it's a fast-moving field of enormous complexity and depth. And how could they keep up with it? I remember, I wrote a book about genomics 20 years ago when the human genome was being sequenced, and somebody saying, look, that's all very well, but I'm too old to learn this stuff. I don't understand it. I said, no, you're exactly wrong, because none of this, almost nothing in my book was known 10 years ago, let alone 20. So it's new for all of us. It's new for young people. It's new for old people. You've got no disadvantage in trying to catch up with it. I think that's quite important. But where I do agree with you, there is a huge problem, and that is the ability to cope with statistics and probabilistic arguments about risk. And there it seems to be very easy to tap into people's folk psychology, which doesn't help them with real psychology. So you can scare them about a tiny risk, or you can reassure them about a big risk, depending on how you present it. And that seems to be a huge issue that we don't seem to be able to solve. We're not getting better at.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because this idea of risk, and we're going to get to talk about your book, but you also talk in the book about vaccines and inoculations, and that's very much relevant now to the issue of the coronavirus and COVID-19, which and you've written some in your column about this probability and the risk issues of the virus, and whether the lockdowns were. Now, in retrospect, of course, everything is in hindsight is 2020. But was the risk of the virus overstated early on, do you think?
I think the risk of the virus was misstated. I don't think it was overstated. Fairly early on, I was going around saying, this is a wolf. We've been crying wolf over pandemic diseases for 20 years, swine flu, bird flu, Ebola, whatever, and the wolf never arrives. This time it is a wolf, because of this strange combination of being very easily transmitted, even by asymptomatic people, and yet capable of killing people, particularly elderly people. So most diseases are either very harmless and very easy to pick up, like common colds, or very dangerous and very difficult to catch, like Ebola or something like that. So it's easy to stamp them out. The combination of the two was, I think, particularly difficult in this case. But we misread this epidemic quite badly, I think. We didn't spot that it was capable of spreading very rapidly and very dangerously in hospitals and care homes and being spread by healthcare workers. And we didn't do nearly enough to stop that process. In fact, we made it worse by sending people home from hospital to make room for all the people who were going to come in from the community with infections acquired in the community. And not that many people turned up with those infections. And so the wards remained empty, while the people who'd been kicked out of their beds had gone back to care homes and gave it to others. So I think there was quite a bad misreading of what was going on. We didn't understand the degree to which it was turning into a nosocomial epidemic, that is to say, something spread within the healthcare system. In terms of lethality, that is where it is. It's very harmless for most people in the community.
42% of the deaths in the U.S., 43% have been in nursing homes, care homes.
Correct.
So in your book, you talk about the efforts on whooping cough in Michigan, Pearl Kendrick and Grace Elderling, which is a story I'd never heard of before. You also
I hadn't until I came across it when I was researching the book. I think it's a beautiful story.
It's an amazing story that these two women, at a time when women were not in the healthcare field to the extent that they are today, and that they pioneered the treatment for whooping cough and didn't really get recognized, made essentially no money from it. You also talk about smallpox, cholera, typhoid, etc. But if you don't mind, just run through that whooping cough story, because it is a remarkable one.
Yeah, no, I think it's a beautiful story. And it's basically 4 years beginning to end from them starting on the project to them having a workable vaccine. That's pretty quick, even by today's standards. They were both bacteriologists. They were both former teachers, but they'd managed to go into science. They were practical bacteriologists. In other words, their job was to analyze samples from the community and do public health work. But in their spare time, they wanted to tackle this whooping cough epidemic, which was at the time hugely problematic. It was probably the biggest cause of death among children in the United States at the time. This was in the early 1930s.
Right.
And they moved on from, first of all, developing a technique for working out how long people were infectious, which was terribly important so that people could come out of quarantine and get back to work, because this was the middle of the Depression. Households were going destitute because they were being quarantined and their breadwinner couldn't go out to work. They moved on from that to saying, we think we could develop a vaccine to this. It's a bacterium. We know how to treat bacteria in such a way that you can make them into a vaccine that's safe but also protective. Other people had tried and not succeeded. They were just really careful, really meticulous. There was nothing particularly brilliant about what they did. They just did it really, really step by step and carefully. They came up with a vaccine. They tested it. They had to find, obviously, people who didn't take the vaccine and check that they did catch whooping cough when exposed to it. And that, of course, is the problem. How do you do that? And the traditional way at the time was to go and get kids from orphanages and say, well, we're not going to give you the vaccine because you're orphans, but we're going to expose you to the virus, the bacterium, and see if you catch it. Well, they didn't want to do that, but they very cleverly retrospectively found a community of kids that matched the ones that they'd vaccinated in every way, except that they hadn't been vaccinated, and showed that these kids were getting whooping cough at a much higher rate than the ones they vaccinated.
10x, if I recall right.
Yeah,
something
it was 10 times as much, exactly.
Yeah.
And so they then presented this data, and the authorities said, that can't be right, too good to be true. We'll have to look at your data. And particularly one researcher from Johns Hopkins sort of came and went through their data, expecting to find all sorts of flaws in it and say, look, sorry, this doesn't prove anything. But he kept scratching his head and saying, well, no, actually, you've done this right. I can't actually see the problem. Let's do another trial and see if it still works. And they did another trial and it worked. And at this point, one of them wrote to the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and said, any chance you could visit and see what we're doing. We're saving lives with a whooping cough vaccine. And she visited and came and went back and said, these people need support.
And spent all day with them, as I recall.
She spent 13 hours with them. Yeah, exactly. It was a remarkable story.
Remarkable story.
And by the end, of course, they've produced a vaccine. It's being rolled out across the country. It's working. It's it's preventing whooping cough on a massive scale. It goes across the world. But by now, World War II has broken out, and there's, it's hard to get news coverage for this kind of thing, and neither of them want to push themselves forward in press terms. Neither of them want to make a hero out of it. Neither of them want to make money out of it, actually. So it really is. It's almost the purest example of an innovation that saves lives on a massive scale, is done right. They don't put a foot wrong, that I could come up with.
And in today's society, where everyone seems to be saying, "Look at me and give me money," and I mean, how quaint that they don't seek remuneration for it, and that really are almost forgotten to history.
Today, they'd almost certainly stumble upon intellectual property barriers too, patents or other defenses that would require a lot of expense to get around. They'd have to negotiate with drug companies and things like that. That wasn't so prevalent in those days.
Sure. Well, I want to come back to the patent idea and your line about the issue of patents and potentially slowing. In fact, you say intellectual property is now a hindrance, not a help to modern innovation. But let me go back, if you don't mind, and talk about one of your first lines in the book where you talk about innovation. You say, innovation means finding new ways to apply energy to create improbable things and see them catch on. I write about energy and power, and so I really was captivated by your history of Newcomen and Watt, but it really was turning heat into work, to use your line, that was the critical innovation that changed from all of prehistory through almost all of the last 2,000 years. But it was that ability to turn heat into work that fundamentally changed humankind. And Newcomen said it started. But then what was Watt? Just briefly, because Watt's been written about a lot. Yeah. And you also say that he was a brilliant inventor, though he undoubtedly was, gets too much credit. So why does he get too much credit?
James Watt, you mean?
Watt, yes.
Yeah, well, in a sense, he's just improving the steam engine. He does the separate condenser, which makes the steam engine much more efficient. It reduces the amount of wastage of energy. But he's also quite a canny operator. He goes into partnership with Matthew Bolton to drive this into business, and it starts to catch on as a machine for running factories and things like that the steam engine does. But he doesn't invent the steam engine. That is Newcomen 2 generations earlier. And he doesn't turn it into a source of motion like the locomotive. That is Stephenson, a generation after him. So in a sense, what... I don't know, because of his name got attached to a unit of energy or something, I think looms a little too large in the story. So he's very important, but he's not perhaps as important as the others. And I'd love to get your reaction, actually, to this point about heat and work, because I've gone around the last few years saying that the key to the Industrial Revolution, what it represents, is the moment when we link the world of heat and the world of work for the first time. Before that, we have lots of energy, and as you say, I have a sort of thermodynamic view of what civilization is. It's the creation of improbable order by the inputting of energy. And we had energy coming from wheat, and we had energy coming from water, and we had energy coming from wood and wind and all these things. But they either went into work, they made things move, machines or people or horses or whatever it was that moved, or they went into just warming up a building, or, making people less cold, like coal and wood did. But there's no connection between the two, with one or two sort of potential little exceptions. Like you could argue that a cannon is turning heat into work. It's certainly making a projectile move, but it's really the expansion. It's the change in pressure, not the change in temperature that's really making the work there. Then along comes Newcomen, and for the first time, and by the way, then it's Papin and I've suddenly forgotten his name, the other English guy, Captain Savory, both play some role, we can't work out what, in preparing the way for Newcomen to do his breakthrough. But Newcomen's a humble engineer from Cornwall, and he really does make an enormous difference, from Devon, I should say. And because what they're doing now, these early steam engines, is taking a furnace, and making that turn something. In the first application is purely for pumping water out of mines, where you've got a cheap supply of coal, so it's useful to do it, and you can take on the horse, as it were, as
Sure.
Become competitive with it. But do you think I'm right that transition, the heat to work transition, is a key part of the Industrial Revolution?
Oh, well, there's just no doubt about it. And in fact, I've thought about this just in the last few days, and the new BP Statistical Review just came out. And still today, after we've heard about, we're about the same age, right? I've heard about solar and wind, and they're going to suddenly take over the world. 84 or 85% of all global primary energy still comes from coal, oil, and natural gas. So
right. And another 5% comes from heat in the form of nuclear power.
Right. So the idea that we're somehow going to move beyond combustion, because that's the mantra, right? We're not going to need combustion, and we won't need fission. In fact, we can harness everything we need. This is the mantra of the Democratic Party in the U.S. I'm not saying this is a partisan. This has been their platform, but this is also the dogma of the environmental left, and some of the loudest climate activists is we can't use hydrocarbons anymore. But you say this great. I mean, you boil it down, get that? Combustion causes pressure. Combustion causes pressure, which causes movement. Virtually all the gigantic amounts of energy that go into making my life and yours happen comes from the conversion of heat to work. And I think that's just it exactly. And the scale of that combustion is so enormous that, again, going back to our earlier discussion about people's ability to comprehend the scale of these energy and power systems that we have, I think that's the difficult part. I think that, and what I see is just getting people to understand that.
It's out of sight and out of mind. And the other factor that I think is so important, and it's very hard to get people to talk about, is the energy return on energy invested. So I give the example, I think it's in the book, where I talk about an abbey a medieval abbey in England, which grew barley every year. And in a good year, it could grow 5 grains of barley for every grain that was sown, and in a bad year 3, and in an average year 4. Right now, think about that average year 4. You've got 3 grains of barley. You've got to keep 1 for the next year's crop, so you've got 3 surplus grains of barley per one you've sown. That's got to feed your horses as well as yourself. It's got to make your beer and all that, but it's also got to pay for, because that's where the energy is coming from, the labor of building the castle or the church or whatever it is that you're building for your overlords. Right. That it's a very thin margin of excess energy. And if you look at today's renewable energies, their energy return on energy invested is equally thin. I mean, you've got to put a huge amount of energy into making a wind turbine and wiring it up and fishing the system and so on. And then it starts to pay you back. And after about 10 years, it's paid back the cost of making the wind turbine, which is no good to man or beast. All you've done is paid for the machine that made the energy. So you're still underwater, as it were. Now, for the next 10 years, maybe you can actually make some net energy, which can help the world. But compare that with a gas well, you're talking something like 600 times as much energy coming out within not minutes, but within weeks of you bringing the well online.
Sure. And that's that you use that one line with autocatalytic, which I'd not seen before, which that idea, and I mean, to build on your idea on the gas wells, there's what's happening in the Permian Basin in Texas now, in other places. In some cases, they're taking gas that they're producing and running their engines off of that to drill more wells. So this idea that it's the wells they aren't drilling themselves, but they're fueling their their own
Right.
reproduction, I guess, would be one way to think about it.
Right. And that's what starts to happen in the coal fields of England in the early 1700s, is that the coal is running the steam engines, which are pumping out the water, which makes the coal mines more productive, and so on. And so you're getting a virtuous circle. And of course, the excess energy is then used to smelt metal, and the metal is used to make the steam engine, and so on. And so you can sort of see how this whole thing of repealing the second law of thermodynamics sort of gets going as a sort of as a self-reinforcing thing, and you can't stop it once it's started. I rely heavily on that in that part of the book, on conversations with a brilliant guy who thinks about this a lot, called John Constable. You may have come across him.
Sure, of course.
So I want to give him credit for that, because he's thinking about this all the time and has done some very interesting lectures on this topic.
Yeah, and you, in fact, I pulled one of the quotes. You said energy transitions are crucial, difficult, and slow. And of course, Václav Smil has made that same point, right? And this idea we're ending the age of coal. No, we're not. We're still, latest data, 36% of global electricity produced from coal. This is the same fuel Edison used on Pearl Street. But then you quote Constable. You said, for the vast majority of history, argues John Constable, the supply of energy from wheat and wind and water was just too thin to generate complex structures. And that's about your idea about this energy return on energy invested. You have to make a big return, especially if you're relying on photosynthesis, because you might have too much rain. You might have too little rain. You might have, all of these other things that can interfere with your ability to have the energy you need to build society. And that's one of the things that I think is so good. But that idea of autocatalytic, right? The idea that the coal is mining itself, I think, is a really powerful one. And the way I put it is, you don't build solar panels with solar panels. I mean, you just don't, right? You don't build wind turbines with wind turbines. But then let's talk about that, because you said, I like this idea of autocatalytic, but the autocatalytic, in other words, the steam engine improving the steam engine, didn't really happen at scale until after James Watt's patents ran out. Why was that so important? Because again, this idea you make throughout the book is that it's not just one improvement. It's these incremental improvements that are created in ecosystems. So why was that Watt's intellectual property a stumbling block to those improvements?
Well, I should say in that case, George Selgin, who's a brilliant economic historian, has said to me, "You're wrong. Actually, that we've debunked the theory that Watt's patents got in the way of subsequent investors. I need to go back and look at what the arguments and counter arguments there is. But I think there's no doubt that if you look at history overall, including some recent cases like 3D printing, or some very boring cases like corrugated iron, I talk about in the book, the expiry of a patent, of a key patent, leads to a burst of innovation. And that suggests that the patent is not helping. The patent is there to encourage innovation, but actually, in many ways, it's discouraging it, because what it's doing is it's allowing the original inventor to tap a stream of effectively monopoly income, a form of rent, without lowering his prices and so on, because he's got a monopoly, and other people can't find a way around it. In industries where they can find a way around it, like software, patents are valueless. But they do, and the evidence suggests, the empirical evidence from around the world suggests that strong patents don't encourage innovation, and in many ways they discourage it. Countries that strengthen their patent systems don't see an uptick in innovation. Countries that weaken them don't see a downtick in innovation. That tells me that conservatives are wrong to be in love with intellectual property. And the reason they're in love with it is because they hear the word property and think that this is exactly like physical property, but it's not, because the whole point of a patent is you still want to share the technology. It's only any good to you if you share it. That is not true of your garden, as it were, or your house.
Sure. Well, and you make the point too about so many of the innovators that we look back to, like the Wright brothers, and the time that they spent defending their patents may have prevented them from improving their own designs yet further because they were so involved in litigation, and which was an interesting point that I hadn't thought about before. That need to defend that property. Right. Yeah. It actually hindered them potentially from going further and making their airplanes or their other inventions work better and better able to compete in the market.
Right. I was very struck by those late 19th century, early 20th century innovators who spent a ridiculous amount of time defending
Samuel Morse.
Samuel Morse is another example. Marconi is another example. These guys wasted years of their life in court fighting off some rival whose claim might have been spurious, but not necessarily. Actually, some of these rivals did have a good cause to say, look, I invented some of this too. Why are you getting all the credit, etc. And you can't help thinking that if these guys had said, fine, let everyone compete. I'm just smarter than you guys. I've been at this longer. I know how to do it. I'm going to produce a better product than you. And that's how people operate in the Silicon Valley digital industry to this day, that on the whole, you don't sit back and hope to defend your patents. You just press ahead and try and produce a new product that's even better than the next one. And you see people copying you and you say, well,
we'll litigate later, right? I mean, iPhone did that. I think Apple did that with Cisco after they rolled out the iPhone. They said, well, you may own that name, but we've got a whole, how long do you want to fight over this? Right. And so they moved forward with it. Well, then one of the other things you have a chapter on Edison, who's become almost a mythic figure, but was also an inventor and innovator who spent a lot of time defending his own patents. But you wrote about the light bulb, and you don't put him on a pedestal, and a lot of biographers do. But you said the light bulb was bound to appear when it did, given the progress of other technologies. So this is a theme throughout your book about, well, there are ecosystems that are set up and that a lot of people are coming up with bright ideas at the same time. So I'm
fascinated by that process. It was Kevin Kelly in his book, What Technology Wants, who really alerted
the technium, right? That was
he talks about the technium, this sort of impersonal thing that has to advance, and it simply finds an inventor to do the advancing of it. But it wasn't just him. Way back to the 1920s, people were documenting this phenomenon of simultaneous invention, whereby 5 different people came up with the first thermometer around the same time, et cetera, et cetera. And the light bulb is the best example. 21 people come up with working light bulbs in the 1870s, roughly, or around that time anyway, independently of each other. And this seems ridiculous. It almost makes it seem like there's a mystic process that, the deity has sent down the idea of a light bulb and has scattered it across the face of the planet. But of course, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that the technology of glass, the technology of vacuums, the technology of electricity, the technology of lighting have come together in such a way that it's sort of inevitable that people will come up with this. And what singles Edison out is that he is not just an inventor. In fact, in some ways, he's not the inventor of the light bulb. He's an innovator. He actually says, I'm now going to do the really hard work of making a light bulb reliable, affordable, and available to everybody. And that is hard work. And his famous quote was, invention is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And so he tries 5,000 or 6,000 different plants before he settles on Japanese bamboo to make the filament of a light bulb. Now, that's someone who gets it. He gets that actually innovation isn't sitting in an ivory tower having a bright idea. It's working out how to make that idea reliable and affordable.
I mean, I think that and available, I think that was the key, right?
Yes.
How do you make it scale? And that's the other, we talked about innumeracy and the vast scale of energy consumption globally, but I think that was the key. And you talk about that same ecosystem of invention. You talk about the automobile, right? And you talk about Carl Benz and the bicycle shop. Interesting that Benz was in the bicycle business, as were the Wright brothers. But that the auto cycle engine, by itself wasn't going to change the world. But then you get a bicycle maker who thinks about an automobile and he uses the auto cycle engine. And then suddenly you create this environment where the automobile comes along and say, oh, well, we can do that. And then Henry Ford comes along and figures out how to scale it.
Exactly.
And that the scale, he didn't invent it all, but he came up with the idea, well, I can get a manufacturing line, and because I can have electric motors, I don't have to have everything run on the belt. I can arrange the factory in a way that is the most suitable for mass production. And that, I guess you call that the innovation that he had was understanding how he could scale the project, the property, how he could scale the innovations to then allow them to become available to the masses.
And Henry Ford, until Henry Ford, all the other German and French pioneers of the motor car thought they were inventing a luxury toy for the rich. Henry Ford says, hang on a minute. I'm going to try and drive down costs here, and I'm going to try and make something that your ordinary man who has a horse and buggy a farmer in Michigan who wants to go to town once a week will want to buy. And he's relentless at driving down the cost. There's a story which is probably apocryphal that Henry Ford sent his employees out all over the country to look to scrap heaps to find dead Model Ts and find out what had gone wrong, what was broken in these Model Ts. And they came back and they said, well, there's broken axles and broken chassis, broken, whatever. Everything was broken, lots of them, except they never found a broken kingpin. Whatever a kingpin is, I don't know enough. But so he said, right, let's make the kingpins to a lower specification. We're wasting our time. We're making the kingpins. We're wasting too much money on kingpins. Never
heard that story. Brings back to mind just one long time ago. My dad was still alive, and he was born in 1920, and he remembers the Model T, right? And we went back. Wow. It was an old vintage Model T race at Chandler Park in my hometown, Tulsa, Oklahoma. But I kind of, wrestled him out of the house. No, we got to go see this. And he just loved it because, I remember these cars. They were,
really?
They were, yeah.
Tin Lizzie.
The Tin Lizzie manufactured through the 20s, and they were made by, the tens of millions. Right. Well, let's talk about scale, because you talk about fusion as well in the book. And this is something that I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. In my new book and last 3 or 4 books I've written, I said, well, look, if we're serious about climate change, we have to be serious about nuclear energy.
Completely right.
But the reality is that when you look at the data since the 1980s, nuclear has not gained any market share in the overall energy mix globally. And it's only being deployed now at scale in China. The Russians are exporting their technology. Rosatom is building reactors all over the world. You wrote that nuclear power is a technology ill-suited to the most critical of innovation practices, learning by doing. Because each power station is so big and expensive, it has proved impossible to drive down the cost by experiment. So can it grow then? I mean, that's the question. There's been some tide, I think, turned in terms of Michael Schellenberger, other people, pro-nuclear environmentalists, climate activists saying we have to be serious about nuclear. Can we get serious, and can it scale?
Well, I think I've, in my own mind, identified that the problem is we can't make new nuclear. We can make the same nuclear over and over again, but that's going to get more and more expensive because we're always adding safety worries to it and saying, well, actually, we need to make it so that you can't have a 9/11 where an airplane runs into it. So we've got to make a stronger shell or something. So we're constantly adding to the cost by demanding more safety from an existing design. If we were able to say, instead of that, let's switch to making a different design that doesn't depend on water and therefore, needs to be pressurized. It uses molten salt instead, and then the fuel is also the coolant, and on paper these are beautiful designs. Why can't we switch to trying the, it's not, we're making nuclear power stations the way we made them in the 1950s. We're not making computers the way we made them in the 1950s. We've made whole transitions. And the answer seems to me to be because licensing a new design costs an enormous amount of money in nuclear and takes an enormously long time. And so when you do that, you don't set out with something that you don't know is going to work. You only set out with something that you do know is going to work.
Because you can't iterate. You can't make 1,000 Model Ts. And so, well, and I take all your points, and I'm hopeful for
that. And that's where small modular might be the answer. I mean, if we can start to make these things small, yes, they're going to be more expensive per unit of power they produce, but at least we're going to start mass producing them in a factory instead of building them like Egyptian pyramids one at a time. And that way we might be able to get the authorities to agree to let us to drive down the cost by changing the way we make them, that makes them even safer, but even cheaper along the way.
Well, but that brings back then the question of what the role of government has to be in that industry. And this is one of the things that I think is really difficult, is that you can't just say to BP or Halliburton or Exxon, oh, just go build a bunch of reactors. I'm sure it'll be fine, right? You have to have the government involved because of the waste issues, because of the safety, because of the public's public resistance to it. Is that going to be then, is that the break? I mean, that is going to and perhaps limit that deployment? Or how do you see a potential breakthrough there in saying, well, look, we're not using light water, we're using molten salt or something else? Because it seems to me we're going to need a regulatory regime change on the governmental level. Otherwise, that government role is going to restrain the innovation that you're talking about.
It would be absolutely lethal to fusion and indeed to molten salt reactors if we simply said we're going to take the existing way we regulate pressurized water reactors and map it across, because we're going to map across an unbelievably complicated, expensive, and on the whole prohibitive set of regulations. Instead, what we need to do is say, how do we set up regulations that are just as good at achieving safety, but are generally permissive? That is to say, they encourage experiment and improvement. And to take an analogy here, in the late 1990s, the Clinton administration got Congress to pass a whole bunch of legislation that effectively made e-commerce possible. And that legislation was not designed to make e-commerce safe. It was designed to make e-commerce possible. And I think that's the sort of key difference one has to try and think of. It was designed to be permissive rather than prohibitive. And yes, you can argue that we have all sorts of problems as a result of e-commerce, but, the growth of Amazon and everything else is not an accident. It actually does stem from a legislative change. Things like, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that made publishers online into platforms not publishers, not responsible for content and things. Now, you can say that's led to all sorts of problems, but in all sorts of ways, they cleared the undergrowth for the industry using regulation. And I think this might be a way of thinking about nuclear, et cetera, is how do we set up regulations that actually make it easier to do this while not intruding on safety? Because you can argue, and Fukushima is the case in point here, that the way we've regulated nuclear has made it less safe. So, for example, the Fukushima design was an old reactor past its natural life. It should have been closed down. It wasn't closed down because the Japanese couldn't get around to building a new one because it was too expensive to build a new reactor. So they just kept it online. It had some unbelievably simple and basic design flaws, such as having your water pumps in a basement that could get flooded. As a result, it exploded, and it didn't do that much harm when it did. Nuclear power is unbelievably safe. It's far safer than solar power. It's far safer than wind power in terms of how many people it kills per unit of energy it produces. Chernobyl was the stupidest design of reactor with all sorts of really dangerous features where it could run out of control very easily, run by the stupidest regime in history, with no skin in the game, and they still only killed a few hundred people. We never quite know how many, but it was not nearly as many as we originally thought it was going to be.
So, and those are all great points. So if I can boil down what you just said, then if we're going to have nuclear innovation, we need government innovation on the regulation of nuclear. Well, how possible is that? I mean, truly, I mean, I don't mean to be cynical, but I mean, you make this great vignette in the book too about airships. What was it? The R100 and the R101, right?
That's a lovely story.
It is. It's a remarkable story, but for the people who haven't read the book, and by the way, the book, and my guest, Matt Ridley, his book is How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. The year was 1930, I believe, the R100 and the R101. The R100 was built by Vickers, the British.
This is when the theory was that you'd never be able to build a heavier than aeroplane that could cross oceans with significant numbers of passengers. It was just, large planes that could, the Lindbergh could fly across and Alcock and Brown could fly across the Atlantic, but only in small, tiny planes. If you wanted to take lots of people or lots of things across the ocean, you were going to have to build lighter than air devices. That was the theory of the time. And Britain, having a far-flung empire, thought, well, hang on, we ought to get ahead in this. And so the government commissioned Vickers, which is a private company, to build the sort of airship that could cross the Atlantic. And it started work. And then the government changed in the UK, and the first Labour government came in 1924. And they said, well, we can't have this project being a private sector project. We believe in socialism. We believe in the state owning the means of production. But they found it was too late to cancel the Vickers contract. So they said, well, that's all right. We'll build a rival airship. The state will build it, and it will fly to India. And we'll have these two projects, the R100, which is private, and the R101, which is public. The R100 came in ahead of target, under budget, and it flew to Canada and back without mishap. The R101 was late, over budget, over-engineered, and on its maiden voyage to India, it got as far as northern France before it crashed, killing 48 people, including the Minister for Air in the government. So that was quite a nice controlled experiment in whether the government is as good at innovating as the private sector. And the answer was fairly clear.
And deadly, and a deadly answer.
Deadly.
Well, so let's go from that now to come to the issue of hydraulic fracturing, which you talk about as well, which has fundamentally changed America's energy fortunes. The oil and gas industry now in the U.S. is clearly being hurt very badly by the downturn in oil and gas prices. But here's an example of sustained innovation by a lot of different private companies spending tens of billions of dollars, making, as I see it, hydrocarbons incredibly cheap for consumers. But the companies that perfected these technologies, none of them made any money. I mean,
right.
It is a remarkable example of innovation where consumers win, but the innovators fail. I mean, at being profitable.
Absolutely right. And that is quite a common story. I probably don't pull that idea out enough in my book, but, if you think about railways, they benefit consumers enormously, but huge numbers of people go broke trying to build railways. And it's quite often the case, this. And the hydraulic fracturing story is truly remarkable in that sense, and couldn't have happened anywhere but the US, because nowhere else has got the wildcat energy industry. Everywhere else it's either nationalized or it's big national champions like Shell and BP and things like that. The small experimental wildcat industry doing deals with landowners, et cetera, is really important. But with access to deep pockets of capital too. And if government was good at innovation, then Mexico and Brazil and Venezuela and all these countries with huge national oil corporations, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., they would have done the hydraulic fracturing revolution, but they didn't. They left it to an old played-out field in the suburbs of Fort Worth, and a guy called George Mitchell, who wouldn't take no for an answer when his engineers kept saying, we can't get any more gas out of this field. Try this, try that, try something else, poured his fortune into it, very nearly ruined himself in the process. And one of his engineers, Nick Steinsberger, stumbled upon a recipe that worked really well. And to this day,
the slick water frac, which was just basically water with a little algicide and a little soap and a lot of sand, and suddenly
but crucial again was putting the water in first and the sand in second, or something like that. Right. It was a
trial and error.
It's a lot of trial and error and a lot of tinkering.
So explain, you mentioned our mutual friend Chris Wright in the book, and I'm a great fan of his. What was Chris's role? He was his company was Pinnacle at that time, wasn't it? Was mapping the fractures in the rock in the subsurface?
Yeah, that's right. And Chris had developed these devices for sort of measuring pressure underground, or for microseismic, so you can work out what's going on underground. And he was therefore trying to analyze how fractures propagate through rock when you use hydraulic fracturing to crack the rock. And he basically sort of came up with a formula that seemed to fit what was happening, and argued that the fractures sort of spread one way, and in fact they were going the other way. And he thought that the fractures were best propped open using thicker gels, not thinner ones. And he then had to do 180 and say, you know what, I'm misreading my data. I think actually the fractures are propagating laterally, and they're doing so with the slick water is better at cracking the rock than the gels. So instead of putting nasty toxic gels down, we can just put water down, basically.
Sure. It was these incremental. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So he's not the inventor of this, but he's the person who understands the physics of what's going on underground, and is helping to explain it to people, and therefore it's quite a nice example of how the wildcatters on the ground are coming back to the physicists like Chris and saying what's going on, and the two are feeding off each other, the science and the technology. And Chris then became a pioneer of hydraulic fracturing and is one of the most efficient operators in the industry, and such a smart guy, and really understands energy better than anybody I know, with yourself accepted, of course.
Chris Wright, by the way, is the founder and CEO of Liberty Oilfield Services in Denver, and has been talking about and writing about and been a great proponent of American energy. But I didn't know until I read your book. I'd known Chris for several years, but didn't know his role in the way that you explained it. But I think it is remarkable, and now the shakeout in the hydraulic fracturing business and drilling, where in the Permian Basin here in Texas, which I would argue is perhaps the most drilled province. No, it is the most drilled province in the world, still producing massive amounts of oil and gas, and so much gas, in fact, that it's being flared. Tremendous waste of available energy, but it's indicative of just the massive quantities of energy that are being produced. Well, let me follow on that, because I think this follows on pretty well in terms of this idea of available capital and people willing to experiment. You wrote, innovation happens when people are free to think, experiment, and speculate. It happens when people can trade with each other. It happens where people are relatively prosperous, not desperate. It is somewhat contagious. It needs investment. It generally happens in cities. Your argument, and it's in your title, is about freedom, that that liberty is essential to this idea of being able to think freely. So, but you also talk about China and the rise of China and some of their innovations. So how does that square with are repressive regimes able to really facilitate innovation? And if not, why not?
Right. Well, I have to have a special explanation for why China is a very innovative country at the moment, given that it's not a very free country. And this may sound like special pleading, but I genuinely think that I can explain that. And the answer is that China after Chairman Mao died, Deng Xiaoping brought in a new approach in which he basically said, so long as you don't annoy the Communist Party, and so long as you don't try and do political innovation, then you can get on and be an entrepreneur. And in fact, you'll be even freer than your competitors in the West, because there won't be that many petty officials saying, have you broken local environmental regulations or local zoning and planning regulations? There's none of that nonsense. You can just go ahead and do what you want. And so that, to a remarkable extent, for the last 40 years, that has been true in China, that entrepreneurs have been very free to experiment as long as they don't get into politics, as it were. That's been the sort of compromise that was reached. I think that's changing quite fast under Xi. I think he is such an authoritarian figure, so intent on top-down direction of what people do, so intent on deciding what innovations he wants to happen, that he will kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. And I think that China is running on fumes now. It is seeing extraordinary innovation in terms of consumer digital electronics and all that kind of thing still happening. All the Alibaba and Tencent and WeChat and all that kind of stuff is remarkable. But at a certain point, that will dry up. And the hope that China is going to be the area that changes artificial intelligence and biotechnology and nuclear power and all this kind of thing, I suspect they will disappoint. Because what is happening in China now is a sort of replay of what happened when the Song dynasty fell, and after a Mongol interregnum, the Ming dynasty arrived. The Song emperors were absolutely determined to devolve power. They still monopolized military power and so on, but in terms of economic decision-making, they delegated it to the local level. And this was around 1,000 years ago, and this was when China invented, the compass, gunpowder, paper money, porcelain, printing, all these, this extraordinary wave of innovation that came out of China around the same time. The Ming emperors said, no, we want mandarins in Beijing to tell everyone what to do every minute of every day. And every merchant must send a report on how much inventory he's got once a month. And he needs to get a permit from a mandarin before he can leave his local village to go to another. And by the way, we're banning international trade. And they killed China. I mean, China then turned gradually into an extremely poor and benighted country that produced no innovations for several hundred years. So in miniature and at speed, we're seeing the same switch from a relatively free country beneath the surface of politics to a relatively non-free country. And I wouldn't bet on China long term.
So who would you bet on?
It's a really good question. And in the book, I say, well, what about India? India is an enormous country, a great big free trade zone. It's a very well-educated country. It's a country with huge investments in the service industry already. It's an English-speaking country. It's a country that values science and technology. It's got a lot going for it. It's a country that has a sort of addiction to what you might call spontaneous order or exchange and specialization or markets. It's markets run in the blood of Indians.
And yet it's enormously poor. The infrastructure is terrible.
Well, that's the main problem, is the infrastructure and the corruption are huge problems. And if India could sort that, it could conquer the world. And by the way, I think India is where it all started. I mean, if you go back far enough in history, before China achieves anything, before the Mediterranean achieves anything, it's the Ganges and the Indus Valley where you really get innovation and civilization starting. And things like the invention of the decimal numeral system and the idea of zero and all these kind of things, which I also write about in the book.
Sure.
But it might not be India. It might be back to America. It might be Brazil. It might be a small, benighted, rain-soaked island that has just broken free of an empire off the coast of a continent called Britain.
Well, but to go back to where you were talking about China, though, what you've argued or what I heard you say, I'll replay it back, was that the political power has to be diffused that it can't be too concentrated. That
correct.
That the diffusion.
And what made America so brilliant was its federal system.
Right. So that the concentration of power that the communist Chinese that insist on now, right? You're saying that Xi's crackdown then is going to prevent it from moving forward. India, it does have this federal system, but is the government there and too weak and the corruption too weak or the corruption too prevalent to allow that synergy of different forces and capital and technology and intellect to come together to allow it to really create an economy that's big enough and robust enough to bring it out of still desperate poverty overwhelming.
It has achieved remarkable things in the last generation. India was an unbelievably impoverished and backward place under the socialists who took over after independence. But then along came Manmohan Singh, the finance minister in around 1990, and said, let's try and liberate the economy. Let's do pro-market reforms. And it had a remarkable effect. And India became, a tiger that grew at extremely rapid rates and saw enormous improvements in technology and everything else. It's then sunk back into a degree of economic nationalism, as you say, poor infrastructure and corruption, and so on. But don't write it off. There's a lot happening in India today.
But it's interesting your point about the United. I'm bullish on the U.S. I think for all of the problems we have, political division and the rest of it, we still have a relatively young population. Our demographics are positive. In migration, people still want to move here, right? And for all the talk about immigration, that we're still an attractive place for people to come to from all over the world. And we still take this whole Constitution thing seriously. I mean, people in the United States, the First Amendment, Second Amendment, these are things that are in our daily discourse. And the
rule of law, property rights, all that kind of stuff. But also, you've got the competition between regimes in the US. So just a few weeks ago, Elon Musk was cogitating about moving from California to Texas. And the reason he was doing that was because he didn't like the rules in California, which were being made more and more difficult for an entrepreneur like him. That's exactly what entrepreneurs did in Europe for hundreds of years. One of Europe's secrets was that it never got unified into an empire. Lots of people tried it, Charles V, Napoleon, Hitler. It never lasts for very long when you try and turn Europe into an empire. It's got too many bits that stick out, too many offshore islands, too many mountain ranges that get in the way of your army and things. So it's a very difficult place to unify, unlike China. And its rivers flow outwards rather than through the middle is another reason. So there's geographical reasons why Europe never gets unified. And that resulted in a series of competitive city-states and countries that for a long time were saying to innovators and entrepreneurs, if you don't like the regime you're under over there, come and work in mine. I can give you a more congenial place to work, roughly as is happening between US states today.
That's interesting. So Venice competes with London, competes with Singapore,
Correct.
Competes with, Singapore's not in Europe.
Someone like Gutenberg, didn't like the conditions in Mainz, so he moved to Strasbourg, or was it the other way around? I can't remember, but it was that sort of thing. And by the way, this is the problem with the European Union, which is not good at innovation, has shown it completely incapable of producing a digital giant to rival Amazon, Google, Apple, or in their Chinese equivalents. It's the huge failure on the part of Europe's part. It's killed biotechnology. A lot of consumer goods, etc., you're not seeing the innovation you do elsewhere. On the whole, where we have to rely on other people doing our innovation for us in Europe. Why? Because the European Union has this model that it wants the rules to be the same everywhere. It doesn't want safety to be the same everywhere. It wants the rules to be the same everywhere. That's the difference. It wants harmonization, not mutual recognition.
And the currency, which to me was, well, let's talk about this. Since you've broached this already, you've been an advocate for Brexit for a long time. And Northern Ireland is still now in the middle of the whole discussion of Brexit, at least from where I'm seeing it. Tell me what your view is on the progress that Boris Johnson has made on Brexit and how you see it playing out now. And you think, obviously, I'm going to assume, I'm going to tease you here, not prompt you. you think Brexit is really going to allow Britain then to thrive and to be able to reinvigorate its economy. Is that fair? Is that a fair statement?
Yep. That is roughly what I think. I wasn't necessarily in favor of Brexit. I was in favor of us trying to persuade the European Union to reform its systems to be more pro-innovation. And David Cameron set out to achieve that reform, and I said, good luck to him. And he basically got a complete brick wall from the European Union, at which point I said, right, well, if they won't change, then we've got to go. I actually edited a book. It's over there on the shelf called Change or Go. I was one of the many editors on it. And so I campaigned, along with many others, for us to leave the European Union. To many of our surprise, we won that referendum by a relatively secure margin. And we then faced a 4-year rearguard action by the establishment within politics, within the civil service, within business, to try to reverse the decision of that referendum. And it culminated, and at the same time, the European Union tried to drive such a hard bargain that we would change our minds. The good old British people said no. We said we want to leave. We want to leave.
We voted. We're out.
And eventually they were able to get a champion in Boris Johnson, who went to the country in an election last December saying, "Do you want me to get Brexit done?" That was his slogan. And the people returned a landslide majority for him to do so. So we then did leave on the 31st of January legally, but in a transition period where none of the rules could change for a year. That position comes to an end on the 31st of December. The European Union has said, and lots of people in Britain have said, because of this pandemic, surely we better delay that. Let's extend the transition. And Boris Johnson has said, no, we are not extending the transition. We are leaving at the end of the year. And that is now accepted by the European Union. So we're hammering out a trade deal with the European Union. They're trying to drive a hard bargain, and they're on the whole cutting off their nose to spite their face if they do so, because they trade with us as much as we trade with them. In fact, they export more to us than we do to them. We are simultaneously opening free trade agreement talks with the United States, with Canada, with New Zealand, with Australia. And we have lots of people in our country who want to creep back into protectionism and say, oh, well, what if the Americans send their horrible food over here? We can't have that. Why not? It's great food. We all eat it when we go on holiday to Disneyland. What's wrong with it? And there's this myth out there that somehow the Americans wash their chicken in chlorine and we don't. And God knows who started this. A, it's not true. You don't wash your chicken in chlorine. You of course you wash your chicken like we do, like everybody does, but it's not in chlorine. But this phrase chlorinated chicken is called on. And B, there's never going to be a great transatlantic trade in chickens. I mean, your chickens are no cheaper than ours. So why would we go all the way to Georgia to buy chickens when we could grow them at home or from nearer to home? So those are the arguments we're having at the moment over trade. But for me, the prize of Brexit is to unleash innovation. And so just to give you an example, biotechnology in agriculture is impossible in the European Union. If we change the rules, we can do it in the UK. We've got great science. We will then see a gold rush of entrepreneurs to Britain saying, right, we can work on the kinds of crops we want to in the European context in Britain because it's got different rules. All we've got to do is use the same rules about what a GMO is that Canada and Argentina and Australia and America use. We're not talking about going down some route of doing things dangerously. We're just going down the route of making it possible.
So
sorry, that was a long ranting answer.
It's great. No, it's good. But it's particularly interesting, I think, on the agricultural front about GMOs, right? That's one of the key issues, right? And your countryman Mark Linus has been a great advocate who I've met a few times.
Correct.
Friendly with that, he was saying, no, this is innovation that's absolutely needed, and you talk about gene splicing in your new book, How Innovation Works, but that's critical, I think, and it is critical, especially if climate change is if we're going to face significant changes in climate, well, then we're going to have to adapt, and we can't tie our hands by saying, oh no, we're not going to modify plants. Well, we've been modifying plants, we've been modifying animals for a long time, breeding the best kind to get these, the best results. So anyway, back to that. So what about, you're bullish, potentially, I'm bullish on the U.S., you're bullish on Britain, we should be, we're, root for the home team, but other countries could be somebody like a country like Vietnam, or another country, an emerging economy that could foster the kind of innovation that would allow them to be a major player that we're not, is not thought about as one of these possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, the Asian tigers are always interesting. And, Japan had its moment in the sun, and it isn't such a great source of innovation these days because of its sort of over-mature economy and things like that.
But big demographic problems.
And a huge demographic problem. Yeah, exactly. But the interesting point, though, which is assumed by you and me in this conversation, is that it has to be somewhere. In other words, it's not going to be everywhere. And why is that? And if you look at history, this has been true. California really dominated innovation for a period. Victorian Britain totally dominated innovation. The Netherlands at one stage, Renaissance Italy, ancient Greece, parts of China. It's the innovation bushfire doesn't burn over the whole globe. It breaks out in one place very intensely. And that's partly because it attracts talent to it and so on. And once it gets started, the autocatalytic effect kicks in and it just gets better and better and it races away until it starts to do something stupid, like the Chinese did to kill the Song period of innovation. But why? But is it possible that in the 21st century, the country that does innovation best might not be a country at all? It might be up there in space. It might be the web. It might be the cloud. If we can get blockchain working well, so that effectively contracts and currencies and all those kind of things can float free of national boundaries, then it's just possible that the country that becomes the most innovative will actually be not a country at all. That's an interesting thought that I don't actually have in my book because it's occurred to me since I wrote the book.
So that would be the ultimate decentralization, right? The ultimate diffusion of power, diffusion of, that idea. I mean, I wrote about this in my book, A Question of Power, and it's one that still fascinates me, the rise of electric cooperatives in America. Well, that was part of the New Deal, right? And it was George Norris and Sam Rayburn and Burton Wheeler, along with FDR, passed Rural Electrification Act, Public Utility Holding Company Act. Well, that diffused economic and political power throughout the U.S. in a way that perhaps no other bit of legislation ever has achieved, right? Because then
and I don't think we're thinking nearly hard enough about decentralization. I just think that again and again, we keep drawing power to the center. We do it in the UK, we do it in European Union.
Is that just what governments do?
You do it to Washington as well.
Is it just the nature of government that it wants to agglomerate more and more power, that's just the way it always works?
I mean, I think it's public choice theory. It's that, bureaucrats are in the end self-interested. They argue that they're not, but of course they, given the opportunity to give themselves bigger budgets and bigger responsibilities, they always take them if they can.
And they measure it by how many laws they can pass, right?
Right.
And that's success, right? Not
exactly.
how many they can necessarily repeal.
Yeah.
Well, we've been talking for more than an hour. We talked a little bit about vaccines and we've talked about optimism and where innovation is going to happen. So look into since you have your crystal ball out now. So what about the virus? What about coronavirus? Where do we go from here? And this be the last topic we talk about, but I mean, the prize, I'm not going to expect Pearl Kendrick and Grace Enderling to come along again and be selfless. But the potential prize for the pharmaceutical company that says, oh, we've got the vaccine. This is the prize of the modern era, right? You pass this.
Yes, but the vaccines have not been profitable for the pharmaceutical industry on the whole. And that's one of the reasons we find ourselves in this bind where we're not ready to go with a potential vaccine for this disease. Vaccine development has been horribly neglected, I would say, as an example of innovations that we should have been doing much more of in the last generation. Instead of inventing new video games, it'd be nice if we'd invented a few better vaccines. And the reason is because pharmaceutical industries can't make money out of them. It's very expensive to develop, and then it works. Or it doesn't. If it doesn't work, you don't make any money. If it does work, it does itself out of business, and suddenly the epidemic goes away. It's not like a statin or something, which just goes on being a money spinner for generations. So on the whole, the private sector has not invested in innovation in vaccines to anything like the extent it should. Nor has the public sector. I mean, what on earth has the World Health Organization been up to all these years? It certainly, 5 years ago, they put out a statement saying the greatest threat to human health in the 21st century is climate change. Well, that doesn't, to me, suggest an organization that's concentrating on its day job, right. which is to protect us from pandemics.
Right.
But there are some smart initiatives out there, and a lot of them came from the Gates Foundation, which I think is a great force for good in this area. Gates set up a prize called an advanced market commitment for developing a pneumococcal vaccine. Essentially, they said any company that goes out and does this and gets an effective pneumococcal vaccine that can be used in the developing world to prevent kids dying of this respiratory disease, mostly poor kids, and therefore they can't afford to buy expensive vaccines. If you can invent a vaccine that does that, we will top up the price you can charge so that you get properly rewarded, but the vaccine is available cheaply. And that worked brilliantly. 3 companies won the contracts. 750,000 lives have been saved already. Now, Gates, together with the Wellcome Trust in London and a couple of other governments, have set up something called the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, which is essentially saying, can we get generic vaccine development platforms oven ready so that when there's a pandemic, we're ready to go? They set this up in 2017. It's exactly what we need. It was too late for this one. It should have been set up 10 years earlier. So that's the kind of initiative that I think we need to be seeing. It will be an innovation that solves this problem. It might be an app. It might be an antiviral medication. It might not be a vaccine. It might prove very difficult to develop a vaccine.
So how soon then? I mean, are you bullish that we could get something by the end of the year? I mean, these have long lead times and enormous investment costs and so on.
Yeah.
But, it also occurs to me, as you mentioned Gates, there's another example of decentralization where you have a vast philanthropic organization that can operate independent of governments and independent of states.
Yeah, well, I had a disagreement with Bill Gates once about exactly this in a conversation. He was haranguing a group of people in London over lunch about the British government's aid program, because there was a threat to cut it and say, look, we're wasting a lot of this money. We shouldn't be spending it on aid. And he said, that's a disgraceful position. You should not be taking that. You should be pressing for more aid to the developing world. And I said, well, hang on a minute, Bill. You've gone out there and shown that you can turn malaria around. Malaria was getting worse until 2003. It's now getting better. That's because you championed the insecticide-impregnated bed net, and that has been responsible for most of the diminution in malaria deaths. That's fantastic. Lots of other achievements that the Gates Foundation has done. Doesn't that prove that it proves that aid works, but it also proves that government aid has not worked. They should have done this 40 years ago. They should have, what were they doing all these decades until you came along and showed them how to do it? So it's your very achievements that show us that we are wasting a lot of our aid money that's done through the public sector. Huh. And because I dressed this criticism up as a compliment, he didn't quite know how to respond, I think.
So back to I'll pose it again. So you're hopeful then that we're going to have some vaccine, some treatment then, because of the amount of talent, money, interest in solving this problem now, that we could get something that halts the pandemic in less than a year?
Well, it's very hard to predict the timescale. Vaccine development is a pretty slow business. We haven't been able to speed it up very much. But we have got so many different new ideas about how to do vaccines now. Messenger RNA vaccines, all sorts of different techniques that haven't really been tried. And in the Ebola epidemic, we got some of them to the point where they looked very promising. And then, of course, Ebola went away, so we weren't able to finalize that. But I think we are capable of producing a vaccine quicker and more effectively than 20 years ago. It's a pity we haven't been ready to do that before this. And the one thing we've shown in this pandemic is that some of the lead times, some of the delays in the process of innovation are completely unnecessary, and we should cut out the reasons for them. We've been taking 5 or 6 years to approve a diagnostic product. Well, we're now approving them in 2 weeks. That suggests to me that there's been a lot of people who've been taking too long over decisions. And so I think we're going to be able to find that we can speed up vaccine development. We're already running phase 2 and phase 3 trials alongside each other and things like that. So I would hope that we would have an effective vaccine to this virus by the end of 2020, which would be far quicker than most people think.
Sure.
But I think, and I'm not going to put 100% on that, of course.
Sure, of course.
I think it's slightly more likely than not.
Gotcha. But then we're going to need 7 billion doses, roughly.
Well, scaling up is a big part of the problem. Yeah.
Right. So just a couple of last things. So you've written 9 books. Does it get any easier? Is it always hard? And I asked this as a writer as well. Was this book harder than your other books? Easier?
This book was not as hard as it might have been for a very simple and rather ridiculous reason, that as I get older, I can't hold as much in my head as I used to, I find. So I can't research for a week and then write for 2 days, or research for a month and then write for a week. I have to research as I go along. So I decided to break this book up into bite-sized chunks. Basically, I would tell one story. And I specifically set out to tell stories because people love stories, and you can't just write a book full of principles and theories. You've got to tell human stories. So I thought I would research to death one particular story of an innovation and write it up as I was doing it, and then turn to a completely different subject. So I broke it up into bite-sized chunks. That made it easier. The other thing that, of course, has made it easier, 20 years ago, I was writing books about genomics, and I was spending weeks in libraries making laborious notes in notebooks from papers in academic journals, which I located by tracking down the references in other papers in academic journals and so on. And it was quite a difficult process. Now, thanks to the internet, I can read those papers at home and I can track them down instantly, and sure, I can do much more random searching. So it ought to be much easier. But then, of course, I'm becoming senile, so it's getting harder for that reason.
So 2 last questions. So working on another book now? I mean, what I find is you write one and everybody asks, well, what are you doing next? Have you started something else? Or are you holding on for the time being?
Give me a break, Robert. I mean,
I say the same
this one hasn't even been published in the UK yet. It's out in the US.
I say the same thing, but I am already thinking about another book myself.
What's the one you're thinking about?
Well, I've been focused so much on the energy field, but what is that going to look like? What is the future of energy going to look like? I mean, are we really going to? I'm very concerned, very focused on the issue of land use, because I think this is one of the big breaks on renewable energy deployment. And in fact, there was a paper that was put out by Cal Berkeley, some guys at University of California, Berkeley. They don't mention land use in their entire thing except one time, and yet we're going to deploy 1,000 gigawatts of new wind and solar. Well, yeah, maybe you should think about where you're going to put this stuff.
The whole point of moving on from the medieval economy was so that we didn't have to use the whole landscape to produce our energy. We could get it out of a small hole in the ground instead. I think it's retrograde to go back to using these. The birds need the wind. The plants need the sunlight. Why are we no plant or animal eats natural gas or oil.
Or coal.
Coal.
So your answer is you're not working on something new. Is that what you're telling me?
I'm not working on anything yet, but I have a feeling that a book on the origin of viruses might be of interest, don't you think?
I think it could well be. So
I think other people may have had that thought.
Yes, there may be more people on that than we are thinking about. So my last question, and we've kind of already discussed it, but what excites you now? What you've had a lot of experience. You have a lot of political experience. You've been in business. What really is motivating you now? The innovation is a big topic, but what really gets you interested and excited these days?
I pinch myself at my luck at being alive when we can understand the farther reaches of space. We can see images from the moons of Saturn. We can read the genomes of sea creatures that we didn't even know existed a few years ago. We can understand the symphony of the dance of the proteins inside a cell that makes it work. We know the secret of life. Isn't it just fantastic, the knowledge that's available? One of my passions is birdwatching and animal behavior. And a friend of mine wrote a book about seabird migrations the other day, based on these new satellite tags that enable us to work out that some birds are doing 15,000 mile round trips in 2 weeks while their mate is incubating the egg before going back onto their shift on the egg. What a world we can live in where we can understand things like that. So what motivates me is the continuing expansion of knowledge. I love it.
Perfect. That's great. We had a downy woodpecker on our feeder just yesterday. Downy woodpecker. It's maybe like
lovely.
This big smallest woodpecker in North America. That was
beautiful.
Yeah. Great. So being on lockdown, what excites me, I like just being really seeing nature again, and that's been really just indulging in it is the wrong word, but luxuriating in it, I think, is the better word. So another common interest we have. Well, look, Matt, you've been more than generous with your time today. The book is just wonderful. It is a collection of stories about innovators. It's a deeply human book, which is one of the things that I truly like about it, bringing to light Pearl Kendrick, Grace Elderling, and other innovators and telling their stories. I highly recommend it, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom.
It's been a real honor and a pleasure, because some years ago, I began to notice that whenever I read anything really sensible and intelligent and interesting and well-written on energy, it often had this name Bryce at the top. And I thought I needed to find out who this guy was. He was so good. So it's been great to get to know you, and it's been wonderful to spend an hour today talking.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt. I just have a couple of other quick comments for our listeners, the Power Hungry podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Robert Bryce. If you want more information on me, I'm easy to find. Matt Ridley's easy to find on the interweb. You can use the Google. I'm at robertbryce.com is my website. I'm on Twitter at Power Hungry, PWR Hungry. You can also look at my new documentary, Juice, How Electricity Explains the World. It's on the web at juicethemovie.com. And you can also rent it on iTunes, Amazon, and your other streaming services. So signing off for now. Thanks again, Matt. It's been great. And thanks to all of you for listening. And I will be back with another episode very soon.